Max Verstappen is among the great names in F1 history, along with Fernando Alonso, Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, and, as a Brazilian person myself, I know some people are going to get offended by this, but even Ayrton Senna. Some people disagree with this, but hold on, let's take a look at some of Verstappen's career achievements and dive into a data analysis to see if this truly makes sense. Verstappen started his career in 2015 at Toro Rosso. At that moment, he became the youngest ever to start in a Formula 1 race at only 17 years old. And since everyone seems to ask me the same thing, yes, he was younger than Antonelli. In fact, the second youngest ever to start in an F1 race is none other than Lance Stroll. Antonelli is the third youngest, 50-something days older than Stroll at the moment they started. And although it is impressive to be the youngest ever to start, that by itself doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of career achievements. A little over a year later, Verstappen got promoted to Red Bull in place of Daniel Kvyat. And at his debut for Red Bull Racing, when he was still doubted by many, he went on to win the freaking race. And at that moment, Max became and still is the youngest ever to win in an F1 race with a gap of almost 3 years to Sebastian Vettel, which is the second place. And the thing is, he kept winning, and is still winning, currently holding the third most number of wins, only surpassed by Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton. Verstappen is so young and has won so many races that if we only look at drivers that have completed more than 100 races, he's currently tied with Michael Schumacher for biggest win percentage, followed by Lewis Hamilton in third, and in fourth we have our beloved Senna. Verstappen not only has the highest win percentage, but also the highest win streak in F1 history. And also shows up twice when looking at the most dominant F1 seasons in terms of win percentage, having won 86% of races in 2023. But anyways, my goal here is not to sit and list a bunch of career achievements, especially since there's a bunch of other things I could list. I want to dig a little deeper. The thing is, even with all of these achievements, I know there are people who still question the quality of this multifaceted athlete. Oh, but if Red Bull wasn't so dominant, he wouldn't have achieved anything. Oh, but what about Michael Masi? Oh, but what about his father's influence? Oh, but Red Bull builds the cars just for him. Okay, calm down. It was especially because of these questions that I decided to dive a little deeper into the data and try to answer. Just how good is Max Verstappen actually? Oh, the intro. Okay, but before anything else, I had to ask myself, how exactly do you measure a driver's quality? Look, it's not easy. And this is because of something that might seem obvious. F1 is made up of two simultaneous championships, the Constructors' Championship and the Drivers' Championship. And it's very difficult to isolate one from the other, because the Constructors depend on the drivers to win anything, and the driver can't win anything if the team doesn't build a good car. In other words, Verstappen can't win without Red Bull, and Red Bull can't win without Verstappen. So I started to think how I could separate one thing from the other, trying to isolate the driver's performance from the team's performances. And I arrived basically at two different approaches. The first one was through an analysis of consistency. The idea here is that a good driver is not only fast, but also consistent. He must be able to work like a clock in terms of lap times. And the second approach would be through a head-to-head comparison between teammates. Here we will be looking at how great drivers performed against teammates in terms of championship, qualies, and racers. And here I will work behind some important premises. Drivers in the same team have access to the same resources, and I believe that in great F1 teams historically, this is mostly true. After all, every constructor aims to win the Constructors' Championship, so it would make no sense for them to quote-unquote sabotage any of the drivers, because that would basically mean less points for the Constructors' Championship. And here, of course, I'm not saying that the concept of first and second drivers don't exist. I'm just saying that it is in the interest of the constructors to give both drivers the same good equipment so both can score good points. But before anything, And before someone gets angry and starts typing angry words in the comments, I want to make a quick disclaimer. No single chart or analysis that I present here will objectively answer how good Verstappen is. You could argue with pretty much every single chart or metric that I show here. Also because at the end of the day, quality is completely subjective. My idea here is to take different approaches towards a single conclusion. So for that, you must look at my analysis as a whole and please don't focus on any single chart or metric that I present here, please. And also, before I can show you the analysis, I have to explain what I did so you can understand what I'm about to show you. Seriously, stick with me, please. And let's get back to the consistency analysis. So, to perform the consistency analysis, I followed this path. I took all of the lap times for all drivers in all races. For each race, I calculated the standard deviation of the driver's lap time. And their standard deviation is nothing more than a measure of dispersion. Meaning, if a driver has a high standard deviation, it means that their lap times varied a lot, meaning they drove more inconsistent laps. If the driver has a low standard deviation, they drove more similar lap times throughout the race. In other words, they were more consistent. So we can simply look at who has the lowest standard deviation of all, and that driver will be the most consistent driver. Simple, right? No, actually, that's not right at all. The thing is, each race is a different race. We have wet races, we have dry races, we have races where the safety car is deployed and others not. So, if I calculate the pure standard deviation without any filters or anything else, it simply won't work because there are many adverse conditions that interfere with each driver's lap time. A race in the rain will naturally have lap times that vary more than a dry race. And here's what I thought. Adverse conditions exist, but all drivers are subject to the same adverse conditions. In other words, if the race is chaos, it's probably chaos for everyone. Based on this, I arrived at a solution for this analysis, and the solution is relative normalization. And now, you might be asking, but what the hell even is relative normalization? It probably sounds like something that the explanation will make you sleep in statistics class, but stick with me, please, because this is key to the consistency analysis. Normalization is basically transforming data so that stuff that may not have been originally comparable. That means neutralizing external interference. In other words, I'm trying to level the playing field. This is only possible because in a given race, everyone is under the same external condition. But how exactly do I do that? Well, that's where the relative in relative normalization comes in. First, what I do is I calculate their standard deviation for every single driver in every single race. After that, I calculate the mean standard deviation for everyone. In other words, the field average. Remembering that this value is probably high for races with adverse conditions and lower for races with no adverse conditions. Then what I do is I take the standard deviation for a given specific driver, let's say Max Verstappen, and I subtract the field average from that. And that gives me basically a new metric, which is the relative standard deviation. Again, this is calculated by the driver standard deviation minus the field standard deviation. When we look at this, since lower values are better, negative values mean that the driver was more consistent than the average, and positive values mean that the lap times of the driver were more dispersed, therefore he was more inconsistent than the average. And that is calculated for every single driver in every single race. And then what I do is I remove first lap, safety car laps, in and out pit laps, races where the driver did not finish from all the calculations because these are not representative of overall pace. And then what we get is... Look at this. This is the result of the analysis for Max Verstappen. What? So you thought I was gonna show some simple result with a simple interpretation? A ranking showing who's boss? No, unfortunately, I didn't say I will do that. But calm down, let me simplify this. This is just a histogram of the relative standard deviation that I just explained. This chart basically shows value frequencies. For example, take this bar right here. This means that Max Verstappen has had 7 races where he had a slightly negative relative standard deviation. Oh god, that's a mouthful. In other words, I'm basically saying that in these 7 races, he was more consistent than the rest of the grid because the value on the x-axis is negative. And That's basically what we want to see in this histogram. It's values to the left of 0. In other words, negative values. That means examples where the driver was more consistent than the average. While values to the right means that there were races where the driver performed less consistent than the average. And thankfully, I can do a couple of things to make our lives a little easier. First, what I can do is add this continuous line here, which basically tries to smooth out the bars of the histogram. Try to understand this by me like putting a blanket over the histogram bars, basically. And what I can also do is add this dotted line right here. This shows the average value of the histogram, basically. You can see that the average value for Verstappen is lower than 0. That means that on average, he should be more consistent than the rest of the pack. But actually, this chart only gets interesting if we start comparing drivers. So let's take a look at someone that I interpret as being a little less consistent than Verstappen. What I did here is I plotted Sergio Perez's histogram along with Verstappen's. First, what we can see is that Verstappen's average value is lower than Perez's. And although that the average doesn't tell everything, this is an indication that Verstappen is more consistent on his lap times. But what is more interesting to me is when we look at the actual histogram distribution. Focus on the continuous line that I showed here. You can see that Verstappen's distribution is leaning more towards to the left than Perez's, which is exactly what we're looking for when we're searching for a consistent driver. You can see how Verstappen's curve starts raising more steeply to the left than Perez's, and how Perez's curve is lower to descend when going towards to the right, indicating the presence of more samples where Perez was less consistent than the average of the field. Now, in contrast, let's take a look at Lewis Hamilton's histogram, which I would consider to be very similar to Verstappen's. First of all, you can see that Hamilton's curve goes a lot higher than Verstappen, and that's simply because Hamilton has had a lot more races in Formula 1. But focus on the actual shape of the curve. You can see how the shape, although Hamilton's is higher, is very similar, both the slope to the left and also the slope to the right. You could actually argue that Verstappen's average value is slightly lower than Hamilton's, but if you look at the right of the chart, you can probably see why. Hamilton has had a few races where he was fairly more inconsistent than the rest of the pack, and that could simply be because of a few mistakes. But I mean, it's only a few samples among more than 300. I would never say that this average value by itself means that Verstappen is more consistent than Hamilton. That's why I look at the distribution as a whole and not only the mean value. And I mean, we could sit here and take a look at this chart for a lot of drivers and compare the distribution for days. And the story is pretty much the same. For some drivers, you can see that this distribution resembles a lot more consistency, and for others, not so much. But at the end of the day, if we only look at the average value, which was the number represented by the dotted line, Verstappen has the lowest average of all the drivers in the little list that I created. The reason why I'm not comparing every single driver in history is simply because F1 evolves a lot, and the car in this generation is a lot different than the car from 20 years ago. So it gets a little complicated when we start getting generation mixed with the analysis. Okay, so we have already listed amazing career achievements. We have already established that he is very consistent. Oh, but it's the car, you still might say. Anyone can perform well on that, right? 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 Okay, you probably already know where this is going. If you watch a lot of F1, you'll note that the second Red Bull City is kinda cursed, and that Verstappen has been superior in terms of results compared to pretty much every single one of his teammates. That by this point, sitting here and telling you that Verstappen has had dominated performances against his teammates isn't an analysis, it's just pretty much stating the obvious. The thing is, the great names in F1 also predominantly had dominating performances against their teammates. But the thing is, Verstappen is on another level on the head-to-head comparison. Let's take a look. This chart tells us on average how many wins a certain driver has had over his teammates on a given season. Max is averaged almost 5.3 wins clear of his teammates. That's more than anyone else in Formula 1 history. And don't even get me started on the points advantage. Although this is slightly less relevant since the point system has changed over the years and also the number of races. But I mean, he dominates on the championship front. That might be easier given that he's clearly Red Bull Racing's number one driver, and I'm not arguing with that at all. But like, what happens when we try to analyze pure pace and speed? Well, if we look at qualifying dominance, the trend pretty much continues. Here I'm showing the percentage of how often a driver outperforms his teammates in qualifying. First, a quick note on number 1, the late Jules Bianchi. A promising talent, unfortunately lost too soon. His percentage is massive, but it comes from a shorter career against a single teammate. It proves that he was special, but statistically a smaller sample size and not really comparable to a lot of other drivers here in this list. Now, look at Max, sitting in second place with 79% ahead of Alonso, who, let's be honest, has had Stroll as his teammate for the last few years, Vettel, and Hamilton. And if we try to look at by how much these drivers are overcoming their teammates in terms of milliseconds on average, top one is still Jules Bianchi, then we have Mick Schumacher, and not Michael Schumacher by the way, and that is maybe more explained by the teammate that Mick had, and I'll leave it at that. Then again, we have Max Verstappen showing up in third, and differently to all of the other names next to him, he's the only one with a lengthy career and several different teammates. In fact, let's focus on Verstappen's career for a bit and look at qualifying win percentage. The only teammate Verstappen has had who was able to match his quali performance was Carlos Sainz on their debut year for Toro Rosso. In fact, if we look at quali times for when both drivers went to Q3, Sainz was the only driver who was able to actually be a little faster than Verstappen on average. Then again, if we stop looking at quali performance, Verstappen was able to beat every single one of his teammates when looking at who finished the race ahead by percentage. The only one who was able to get close, again, was Carlos Sainz on their debut year. In fact, if we look at who was able to finish ahead of their teammates more often in F1 history, we have Max Verstappen with the third highest percentage, only behind the great Ayrton Senna and, again, Jules Bianchi. And just to wrap up, because this is already getting kind of repetitive, I wanted to look at who gaps their teammate the most in terms of fastest race lap on average. And to pretty much no one's surprised by this point, let's be honest, Verstappen shows up with one of the highest gaps to their teammates, only to be surpassed by, again, Mick Schumacher, who was, let's be honest, probably helped by a certain Russian teammate. Okay, so let's get to the conclusion because there's some other stuff that I want to talk about. Yes, I exist. This video wasn't completely made by AI, it just helped me write part of the code for it, pretty much. And yes, I am using my headphones as a handheld microphone. But I wanted to record myself for this conclusion because there are some stuff that I wanted to say. First of all, like, where does this analysis leave us? And first of all, I don't have the pretension to, because of my analysis or anything that I did, to conclude that Verstappen is the greatest driver ever or anything on that sort. Because at the end of the day, as I said, there is no objective metric that answers how good a driver is, and also because quality at the end of the day is completely subjective. However, you can't ignore that he consistently showed up on pretty much on the top of every single metric that I thought of creating for this video. And how people will say, oh, but he's Red Bull's complete priority, number one priority, and the team is built around him. Of course, he's going to dominate his teammates and have a dominant performance. And well, I agree partly with that. I mean, of course, he's Red Bull's number one priority. But I think what maybe you have to ask yourself is, why wouldn't Red Bull make him their number one priority if he can achieve such great results? And I think the flaw in that logic appears when you say, oh no, he has had great results because he's Red Bull's number one priority. And I think there's a logical flaw in that. Because, I mean, when you look at his teammates, he completely dominated them. And you simply cannot say that Verstappen's teammates, all of them were bad drivers. I mean, Perez was able to get his win in racing points before he even joined Red Bull. Sonoda has had good performances in Red Bull's second team, and they all like are not able to perform on par when they join Red Bull. And it wouldn't make sense for Red Bull to like try and sabotage them, because at the end of the day that hurts the team on the constructors championship. It would be for the interest of Red Bull to have a guy that is at least close to Verstappen in terms of points, in terms of results. And we still haven't been able to see that in Formula 1. And I mean, at some point also, I kind of have to stop looking at data and watch F1. And I mean, just to see what Max did in Brazil in 2024 and then in this year in 2025, they were amazing performances. And then I find myself asking myself, who do I think would be able to produce similar performances, to pull those performances off 2 years in a row? And I can think maybe of two drivers in the current grid that I think would be able to pull that off, and those are Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, and on their primes maybe. And I mean, obviously the list is very, very short. What I'm trying to say is that I don't think Verstappen only looks good in the data, but also when you watch F1 for what it is, and he's clearly an amazing driver with great talents ever since he joined F1 pretty much. And just to wrap up, I mean, is he the best ever? I'm not confident enough to say that he is. No, in no way, shape, or form. But what I'm confident to say is, I mean, he's consistently showed up on top of every single metric that I thought of creating. He has had great career achievements. I've watched amazing performances from him. And I mean, I think whether you love him or hate him, in my opinion, I think he's one of the greatest talents to ever grace the sport. So yeah, that's it everyone. I mean, thank you very much for watching. This video really means a lot to me because it took a lot of time to put together. And actually it took so long that the data is technically a few races old by now, but don't worry, all of the analysis pretty much stayed the same. The only thing that would change, I think, is the number of wins and slightly some percentages. I'll put the updated analysis in my GitHub later. And actually, a huge shout out to the Jolpica, I think that's how it's pronounced, F1 API for the data. I took their database dump for this analysis, and if it wasn't for it, I wouldn't be able to make this video. And also, I'll provide the GitHub link right here in the description for my project, and if there's even some extra charts in there that didn't make the final cut. And yeah, it's in Portuguese, but if there's a single person that wants me to translate it to English, comment down below and I'll do it. And yeah, be sure to subscribe if you like the video, leave a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.